Alright, so here we're going to watch the replay of Game 2 of that same match. Alright, so we see that I kept a pretty good hand once again at 3 land, 4 spells. This time turn 2 Dark Confidant. It's pretty likely that the opponent has either a discard spell here or a removal spell, something like a Bolt or Push, but if they don't, Dark Confidant can just take over the game. So that would be the hope, is that it just simply sticks in play. That is not going to happen, though. Our opponent does have the Lightning Bolt. We still have a good follow-up, though. So if our opponent plays a creature here, we have Liliana of the Veil. So we can use that to make them sacrifice the creature. We also have Colligan's Command that can potentially bring back the Dark Confidant. Maybe the Bloodbraid Elf later on. So I do like just getting rid of the Goyf, especially because it's a Goyf. We want to Edict it away. Don't want to allow it to attack our Liliana. Alright, so here is a pretty interesting card in the mirror. So our opponent on turn 3 has a Kitchen Finks. So they're able to play it, gain 2 life, and now we don't have any great removal spell for it. So I do think Finks is a good card to have access to in these mirror matchups. It's one of, it's a card that helps. And here it is going to be pretty good. So I'm setting up, rather than Bloodbraid Elfing, which was an option, I want to get this Treetop Village into play and then get rid of this Kitchen Finks on our opponent's turn. That's going to protect the Lily, get back the Dark Confidant, and get rid of essentially half the Kitchen Finks. We still have a Lily sitting in play. So now here's another mirror. So we see our opponent has brought in multiple cards here, specifically for the mirror, Finks and Foamlander Mage. And so we'll see how those fare, but the games definitely tend to be very different, much longer, much grindier. So we see that our opponent was able to deal with that turn 2 Dark Confidant, and now we're both still at 20 life. So we're playing a back and forth game. So here, what just happened? Okay, so I played the Bloodbraid Elf. I alternatively could have played two Dark Confidants. Was a little bit worried about a card like Maelstrom Pulse being a blowout. Decided to take this line with Bloodbraid. We saw Dreadbore, Abrupt Decay, and Liliana, so I went with Liliana being, as it's the card that can get our Bloodbraid Elf off the board while still having that Lily sitting in play. And the fact is that I'm going to plus this Liliana or minus it, depending on what our opponent does here. So I decided, alright, I'm going to go with this line, and then I'm also going to attack. So if our opponent blocks, we can then say blocks with Fulminator and then shoot something, or blocks with Finks. We can still tick Liliana up, and then it's not necessarily in danger of dying to a straight up attack. If our opponent takes this damage, then we're forced to Edict away, most likely, the Kitchen Finks. So it's a pretty interesting attack here. I decided I wanted to try to clear off the board, being that I have basically one additional spell in my hand. So this probably trying to set up the Dark Confidant. And this line forces our opponent to actually burn the Abrupt Decay and discard the Dreadbore. So now that attack actually looks pretty good now that our opponent is sitting on no cards in hand, even though they still have that Foamlander Mage. And they could say get rid of our Blackcleave Cliffs or the Treetop Village. The Lily and the Bob look pretty good moving forward. And really, it's just trying to have this matchup is about having more resources than our opponent. Right now, we have the resource advantage, even though we're down to 3 lands. And if our opponent just lets this Dark Confidant sit in play for a couple of turns, that resource advantage should get a little bit out of control. They did top deck yet another Finks, which is interesting. Most lists do not play multiple copies of Kitchen Finks, but here it's pretty solid. So it's gonna make things more difficult on us. So we found a Raging Ravine and a Bolt. We cannot cast the Bolt yet. So the question now is actually what to do here. So if we play Liliana, what do we actually do with Liliana here? Do we plus? That doesn't seem great because our opponent's empty-handed. If we minus, then we've got a 2-1 attacking our Liliana. We don't really want to have to block with the Finks. We also can't easily Fatal Push the Finks. So there's really actually no great sequence of plays here. So I'm actually just going to pass, I believe, in this situation, being as we're at a high life total. We have Kitchen Finks up. We have Treetop Village. We can afford to take a hit and still sit on this Dark Confidant. Next turn, we're going to have Lightning Bolt available, so the Liliana is potentially a much safer option. And alright, so now we have 2 Lilianas. Okay, so our opponent knows about one of them as we hit one off the bob. So now playing a Lily looks a lot better. We still have many, many more cards than our opponent does, so we're very far ahead here, even though we didn't do that much last turn. So I like plussing Lily. Now our opponent noticeably kept that one card in hand, so it could be an instant speed spell. It could also just be a land. But I like getting Lily up to 4. That's going to keep... You want Lily to be on 4 to keep it out of Lightning Bolt range, out of just a single attack with Bloodbraid Elf range. And it looks like our opponent did just have a Black Cleave Cliffs there, which makes sense. You don't really need more than 4 lands in this matchup. And the nice thing about having a Lily in play is that our opponent is kind of forced to act. So they're going to play a Fulminator Mage. They're gonna right there. So what they did was they Colligan's commanded away our Dark Confidant, getting back their Fulminator Mage. We were then forced to bolt the Finks to protect the Lily. So that was a pretty good sequence from our opponent. Colligan's Command is one of those cards that is a 2-for-1 most of the time when you cast it. And in these games that go long, any type of 2-for-1 type effect is going to be very, very good. So here I want to just get the Finks off the table. Now, the nice thing is that we know exactly what that one card is in hand because our opponent did bring it back with Colligan's Command. So one thing they could have done would have been instead just not brought back that one card and say made us discard a card, because we always have the option of plussing Liliana of the Veil and getting that Fulminator out of our opponent's hand because they only have that one card in hand. So I'm going to go ahead and edict away the Finks just so we don't have to deal with that anymore, and then play the second copy of Liliana to go ahead and plus. Now, this is going to mean we're down on resources. We're now at a point where we've got Lily on 4 plus a Bolt versus an empty hand, but we were in actually a better spot maybe a turn or two ago when that Dark Confidant was still in play. And here looks like another top deck for the opponent. It is a Dark Confidant, but you know, we've got a couple of different ways we can handle that, so it's not really too worrisome. I like just minusing Lily because we don't want to plus it here. You don't normally want to plus Lily when you're the only one discarding to it. Games don't come down to the ultimates that much in this matchup, so you really want to be using it to edict your opponent. Whenever you can sort of edict away a creature of the opponent's and still have that Planeswalker on the battlefield, it's going to be a good setup. Now, notice we are at 12 and our opponent's at 22, but since we're so ahead on resources, we can now start firing up the man lands and actually put a clock on our opponent. You don't need to rush. You don't need to rush with dealing the opponent damage. You can wait, take your time. Even though they are ahead on life totals here, the game is very much in our hands. And so, Tarmogoyf, a nice draw step. Once again, we have the option of taking up Lily, but we know that our opponent is very likely to have either a land or some sort of, lightning bolt. But even a lightning bolt they would have used on Lily. So very unlikely to actually have anything other than a land here. So that's why I'm just not using the Liliana to keep. We don't want to drain our own resources while only forcing our opponent to pitch a land. So, and there is a Raging Ravine, which we have a clean answer to. Lightning Bolt is a really good answer to the man lands in the matchup, which is why you don't necessarily want to burn them early on in the game. So notice I drew Averted Catacombs, not super important. So now if we plus and our opponent discards a land, we're playing with perfect information, and we can deal our opponent 8 damage. So I like plussing while still having the Lightning Bolt available for our opponent's turn. And it was indeed a basic swamp. So now we can start really putting the pressure on. Tarmogoyf has a way of eating away at opposing life totals. And these are these games that they last a long time. Once you get past 4 or 5 lands, those excess lands don't become very important. And that's why we see our opponent correctly holding them in hand. And we're pitching them to Lily because we want to be able to maximize the amount of impactful spells that we cast. So our opponent found a Liliana and is going to quickly use that to get rid of our Goyf. And that's going to make it a little bit more difficult to actually close out the game. Although we drew a Liliana, the Last Hope, which is a good pickup. We can use that to get back the Tarmogoyf or a Bloodbraid Elf, potentially. But I like actually just activating the treetop and just getting that Liliana off the board, because if that Liliana stays in play, it's just going to be hurting our hand because we still have 3 good spells in hand. So I like just taking it off the battlefield. And still, we could have bolted the Lily, but then we don't have an answer to the Raging Ravine on the way back. So this is the safest line of play. And it looks like our opponent doesn't actually have much to do besides activating that Raging Ravine, which is perfect. It's exactly what we wanted to happen this turn. We're able to use this bolt profitably. And now, so our opponent still has 1 card in hand. We can assume because our opponent activated the Raging Ravine that turn rather than cast something, it's a favorite that it's also a land again. So I like, normally with Lily, just taking some advantage with it right away is great. So we're able to minus it, get a creature back. Now if the opponent kills the Liliana, we've still already gotten a big advantage from it. And I'm going to get the Tarmogoyf because we can cast it this turn and really apply more pressure. So we see gradually kind of this resource advantage, and now all of a sudden the board is just very, very lopsided. 2 different planeswalkers alongside of a huge creature. And our opponent has found a Goyf here, but we're not going to Maelstrom Pulse it. Maelstrom Pulse is one of those cards where you have to be worried about losing it to. We don't want to pulse away their Tarmogoyf because it would also hit our Tarmogoyf, being as we're playing the same cards in our deck. So once again, using the sacrifice ability from the Liliana, just getting that immediate advantage out of the Planeswalker. Getting in there for 8 and just kind of closing the door. And this should take us to a deciding game here. It looks like, alright, what's our opponent found? It is another Fulminator. So we note that our opponent has boarded in multiple Fulminators and multiple Kitchen Finks. Both are high-powered cards, and we see no discard. So our opponent has likely taken out almost all of their discard, which is going to make their top decks better and their Bloodbraid Elf hits better. And that is one reasonable strategy to take in the mirror match. And so that Abrupt Decay clears the way, and we're able to get through for lethal with this Goyf.